Hi, this is Paul. I'm going to pick up where I left off. This will be part 2 of Wave 2. Jordan Peterson and Russell Brand commenting on their video starting at about minute 28.
Sitting here, just like, yep, that was, whew. But anyway, that's fine.
Not so much because you said,
And I one of the things I love about this video is the interchange between Jordan and his daughter. It is just charming, endearing. You get a sense of the father's love for the daughter's love and respect for the father, the legacy of good parenting. Not perfect, but it's just good to watch.
Before we did this podcast, we were talking about mentors, and you said that your one of the things that you've done is to pick someone to imitate and to pull yourself towards them by that process of imitation. And then when you got close, you pick someone else to imitate or to compare yourself with.
Compare myself with, not
sure, but it's the same thing. The comparison is the same thing, because when you compare yourself to someone, you start pulling yourself towards them, unless you get envious and resentful.
Yeah, before we hopped on the podcast, I was just talking about how I have, like, I consistently have, I'm getting a lot of opportunities with the podcast I have, but I consistently have my dad to compare myself to, which I think is fine because I have something to aim towards and it's kind of something to get to. And that's what I've done throughout my life is, hey, that person's really smart and interesting. Try and achieve what they're achieving. And then once you get there, you pick somebody above you. And the problem is that means you're always kind of unfulfilled, but it also means you're always growing. So that's what we were talking about.
So that's also why Jung pointed out, for example, he believed that the book of Revelations had been tacked onto the New Testament because the Christ in the Gospels was portrayed too much as a figure of mercy, whereas in Revelations, Christ is portrayed primarily as a judge. And Jung's explanation for that was that every ideal is a judge.
Now, I like his idea that every ideal is a judge. I think that's right. Now, with respect to the book of Revelation, tacked on agency, the whole question of the process of canonicity in the New Testament is obviously a big topic that I'm not going to get into. A couple of comments on the book of Revelation, singular, the apocalypse of St. John. The book of Revelation is, in my opinion, a retreatment of Hebrew prophecy in the light of the revelation of Jesus Christ. Jesus presents himself sometimes as a judge in the canonical Gospels, and sometimes the Father is the judge in the canonical Gospels. And I don't want to get into the relationship between Jesus and the Father with respect to the Trinity right now, because that's another large conversation. Because the Son and the Father, Jesus obviously identifies as the Son of God, and it's helpful to think about what that meant in the context of that day, because the prince, and Jesus actually leverages this in a number of his parables, where the prince comes to the land representing the Father, because the prince is, in a sense, the king, and the New Testament plays off these images in many different books. And in fact, looks back to Psalm 2, Psalm 110, a bunch of other Psalms to continue this conversation. The idea that Jesus is too kind in the Gospels, I look at as sort of I can understand where people get that from, but it's sort of a modern meme, because Jesus is too kind until he isn't, and then everyone complains. And that just demonstrates that even while we're reading the canonical Gospels, we're projecting onto them, especially, and this isn't true of Jung so much, but especially since the counterculture in the United States, we're projecting this idea that the Lord of the Old Testament is somehow this deeply judging, distant father, and Jesus is this up-coast, kind and cuddly son. Well, that only works if you don't read closely, because you can find verses of tremendous pathos and kindness. Look, for example, in the book of Hosea, where where the Lord is just crying over his lost son Ephraim, how I can't give you up. So there are many, many passages of kindness and tenderness of the Lord in the Old Testament. Just read Genesis 3. There's cursing, but there's great care and concern. And you can find many places where Jesus is, whenever he takes up the Son of Man mantle in the Gospels, I believe he is pointing back to the book of Daniel. Now, as I said, the book of Revelation is a revisiting of Hebrew prophecy in the light of Jesus Christ. And another deep theme in the book of Revelation has to do with empire. The subject of the relationship between Christianity and empire is enormous. Tom Holland, Dominic Sandbrook did, I thought, a very interesting episode on empire, and the rest is history. Yuval Harari, I thought, had some very interesting treatment of empire in his book Homo Sapiens. Empire, especially since the counterculture, sort of has a dirty name, and that has been continued in some ways by contemporary, by the critique of colonialism. But part of the reason that I've contrasted Christian nationalism and Christian imperialism is because empire is not so easily resisted if you imagine that there is a right and there is a wrong and there is an ultimate judge. And so the question of empire is dealt with in the book of Revelation, as it is dealt with much more subtly in the other books. For example, as I've been going through the Gospel of Luke and Jesus' march to Jerusalem from chapter 9 all the way into the events of Holy Week, which is this week in the Christian church, my sermon last week on Palm Sunday has a lot to do with empire, because on one hand, Jesus receives the praise on Palm Sunday as being correct. He is the king. And the sign above the cross, King of the Jews, in 3 languages, is posted ironic and mockingly, but again, the way that it's taken, the religious leaders demand that it be taken down. Pilate, I wrote what I wrote. And even Jesus on Palm Sunday, on one hand, receives the praise, and some of the Pharisees say, have your rein in your base. And Jesus says, if they're not singing my praise, then the stones, that's the stones of the temple will cry out in recognition of the King of Kings, of the Son of God, and again, Jesus riffs on this in a lot of his parables. And so he is the king, but the specific type of empire and the means of empire that they wish to promote, Jesus continually resists. That's a huge theme in the Gospels, that Jesus resists the public label of Messiah, even though he accepts it in many ways. What he does is he accepts it, but he disagrees with how empire is pursued in this world. Now, the book of Revelation is very complex in that because, of course, Jesus rides into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday on a donkey, and people always look at that as humble, and that's true. That is from the Hebrew prophets as well. Yet, it is also in the line with David. If you read the book of Samuel, David and his princes all ride donkeys. He doesn't come in a war horse, which would be much more of an imperial animal, but then someone in the comments says, oh, but in Revelation, he comes riding a war horse. That's right. And you've also got questions in the book of Revelation of audience. So one of the book of Revelation begins with churches, 7 letters to 7 churches in Asia Minor. This stuff is endlessly complex. Someone made a comment that I should do commentary on the Bible like I do commentary on these videos, and I don't have life enough to do such a project. So Peterson's point, following Jung perhaps, is that a judge is an ideal is by its very nature a judge. Now we get into questions of agency and personification and a lot of these types of issues. But I think it's a very good point, and I think it's a very powerful point psychologically.
And the ultimate ideal is the ultimate judge. And you could say the ultimate ideal judges your soul. And because that's virtually the definition of the ultimate ideal. And so the ultimate ideal is something transcendent and divine that judges your soul.
Now, again, we have questions of agency in this, and to what degree is the arena agentic, and to what degree is agency agency personified and personal. So, but in these psychological categories, some of those distinctions don't matter anywhere near as much as we think they should.
Now, what that means about the way the universe is constituted, again, I have no idea, but the higher the ideal, the more severe the judge. That's clearly the case. And that should make you quake, I think. It does when your conscience assaults you in the middle of the night for things that you've done wrong. It's because you're quaking.
He often goes back to this. You really have the sense watching Jordan that he is driven, and that comes actually through later in the video once Russell Brand drops out. What a driven life he's led, and in his very stern self-criticism, he even critiques that.
In your boots morally because you failed to live up to this ideal. And there's no escape from that. Not truly. I don't believe there is.
How are you two managing to conduct the intimacy of a father and daughter relationship in this new medium? Having two children, my two little daughters, myself, I love them so dearly. They're children, they're not adults, of course. But I felt like it made me like fantasize a little that, I wonder if I'll work with them. I wonder who they'll be. The idea of bringing your relationship into this space, has it been challenging for you, Michaela, particularly when you hold your father up in such high regard and such high esteem? And I know you've been through a very challenging time as a family, and thank God that you're both well now. But how is it to find yourself in this sort of situation that has a sort of a public dimension to it?
This is his second question. And, this first question he asks, well, I know it's your podcast, but, and he's kind of taken over the podcast in a lot of ways. But again, he's doing so really well because the first two questions were, I thought, outstanding. And this is, I think, an outstanding question too. And obviously for him, it's personal because he now is watching, I think, some good fruits of achievement between Jordan and his daughter. And again, as a pastor, you're often called into situations where things haven't gone well. And I think this even gets into the point that even existence, so Russell can see that, now obviously, would Michaela have a podcast if her father hadn't become a YouTube celebrity? No. But he is. And so she has. And why should any of us blame her? Look at the parents of some of the most famous actors. Hollywood is itself this broad family business too. You find that all the time. So, but I think it's a delightful question, and it's part of what makes this whole video really charming, because to go back to Jordan's point about an ideal, even if the ideal isn't forefronted, Russell Brand seeing, I'll use the word glory, Russell Brand seeing some of the glory of the relationship between Jordan and his daughter elicits in him a desire for glory. And so he asks himself, how can I parent my daughters to the point that they might be able to do something like Michaela is doing? Now again, even what I said about Michaela and her success, well, she could have blown it by now. And I haven't watched a lot of her conversations, but the ones that I have watched, I think, she's growing in it. And again, it's nobody's fault that they're young and inexperienced. And so what do? Well, you go out there and you do things and you gain experience and you take the advantages that have been offered to you. A part of the, how shall I say it? Part of the miserliness of the whole privilege backpack is, and David Brooks pointed this out in a piece, every parent wants to give their children whatever privileges they can. And to look on that and cast aspersions on that, there's a real problem. And in fact, even supremely wealthy people, let's say Bill and Melinda Gates, who have made comments about they want to hand their children privileges, but we all also understand that some privileges are in fact also liabilities, and so they don't want to hand their children billions and billions and billions of dollars. Their children will of course be enormously privileged and enormously wealthy, but you also know that handing your children billions of dollars is also a liability. And so the same for Michaela Peterson. Having now a famous or notorious father is both an opportunity and a liability, and make of it what you will.
Yeah, it hasn't been easy. I mean, for my entire life, especially when I've gotten older, I've said yes to every opportunity that kind of came my way just to see where it would take me. And I think that's something I learned from my dad. Just say yes to everything and see what happens. I started formally working for him in 2018 because I'd already built his kind of social media platforms, just the profiles on, Facebook. I knew how Instagram worked, and I was like, Instagram's the new Facebook, switch. We got to get you a profile there. So, and then I started simple with, I was cutting YouTube videos and just making clips. And then I was booking theaters, and then I started coordinating between companies or agents. And it's been complicated with family. It's not all fun and games. And we get into serious work discussions where we're talking about, I don't know, maybe producing something and whether or not that's a good idea. And I don't really have a comparison, so I don't know if it's more stressful than working somewhere else. The other places I've worked, when I was a kid, I was working at a hockey rink and as a waitress, and I was working at a club at one point, and it's not like that wasn't stressful. So I'm still working in this position, so apparently I like it. And
most definitely.
Oh, again, Peterson Inc. Jordan decided to go with family with respect to a lot of this. Russell, I'm glad. I mean, someone obviously cut it. They had all three cameras going, probably 4 cameras, one on him, one on her, one that's panned back, and then the feed that's coming from Russell. But maybe I'll actually clip this, because this might make a nice thumbnail. And yeah, I do things very I do things
definitely challenging. You've taken a fair bit of public flack, I would say, for people who, because of what's happened to me over the last couple of years, because of people who doubt your motivations and
yes,
and who feel that you might be exploiting me, which I would like to state very forthrightly is not the case. Quite the contrary, you've been of tremendous help, but it's difficult.
This is just a lovely video about father-daughter relationships. It's just beautiful. I love it.
Keep those boundaries straight. I mean, the problem with working with family members is you run into dual relationship problems, and many ethicists think those are best avoided completely, and there's some real wisdom in that, but that doesn't mean it's unethical to enter into a business relationship with a family member, but it does mean that it's fraught with difficulties. It's difficult to be a father and also supervise Michaela's role in my business affairs, for example, because it isn't clear when I'm one and when I'm the other. And it's, I suppose, not clear to her when she's daughter and when she's employee.
There are definitely benefits, though. I found, like, part of the reason I thought that I was good at the role I'm doing was because I was more comfortable pushing dads on decisions that I really believed he should do, pushing much harder than somebody else would push.
Like me, for example.
Like you would push.
She's less agreeable than me, so.
Like quite a bit less.
No.
Yeah. So,
This is a fun video.
so I could make
Congratulations.
Thank you. It makes getting along with people hard, but it's entertaining. Yeah, it was tricky. I mean, I like it. I
wonder. Forgive me interrupting, Michaela. I wonder when the conversation has a
He's taken over this podcast.
propensity to move into areas such as archetypes, and when such strong opinions are being expressed, whether or not you feel like it could be exposing just because of the Jordan, your clinical background and the type of conversations that you evoke. And I'm just talking about the actual conversations themselves, let alone the sort of secondary component when other people start to evaluate, stroke, judge the stuff.
Exposing in what way? What are you thinking about? You mean violation of privacy?
I reckon provocative more. Like if someone, like I feel like if I was talking to my mother or father, it's difficult to imagine my little innocent, albeit potent children. Like, but with the parent, like I feel like that if my mother or father was talking about sort of archetypes and psychic energies and parenting, like that I feel like that, but I could potentially feel like, hey, that sort of that territory is not entirely academic and not and not solely rhetorical, but is in this context is empirical, and I think the very fact that you're doing it is evidence of a great deal of trust and rapport, simpatico between you. I just wondered if it
Think what you want about Russell Brand. He is fun to listen to.
How it feels now that you're actually doing it.
I think I can answer that one.
Okay, I've got an answer too, so go ahead.
At least from my perspective, people have asked me, is your dad like he is on YouTube at home? And the answer is yes. Like, generally speaking, you don't get a 90-minute sermon-like speech with nobody interrupting. But we've been talking about the meaning behind the biblical series and myths, and talking about, what do you want to do in your future since I can remember. So it's not something new at all, and it doesn't seem uncomfortable because that's how I was raised.
And it doesn't. And having a public component doesn't make it jarring.
Because there's still a distance, right? Like even in 2016 or 2017, there's a distance between reading about it in a newspaper. It's weird. Like, you walk down the street and dad was on a newspaper, and I'd be like, that's jarring. But at home, it's not jarring. Even doing podcasts like this, it's intimate, right? It's just us three. So there's the public element, but maybe it would be different if it was in front of a crowd. But it hasn't really seemed less intimate. You've had a different experience.
Well, I think we're both relieved and pleased to be doing something together that isn't intensely focused on like fatal or highly painful illness.
Yeah.
Because that's just been nonstop for way too long, way too long. And so this is a break from that. It is very strange, but we're in a strange world. I'll never get accustomed, I don't think, to the degree to which I've become public. And that's something I wanted to ask you about. I mean, you got famous And there's nothing more appalling than
It's interesting because he pursued Matthew McConaughey. Now, of course, Russell Brand and Matthew McConaughey are more famous than Jordan Peterson, and this does get into a theme that I've picked out a little bit before in terms of Peterson likes to talk about, let's say the social medias, YouTube, podcasting. YouTube and podcasting are sort of halfway between mass media and social media, but that versus the mass media platforms. And I still assert that the mass media platforms, despite the pegs that they are being taken down now, are still enormously powerful. And many of those who blow up very big on social medias do so because of mass media. I mean, people try to get on The Bachelor or The Bachelorette in order to become influencers, et cetera, et cetera. Joe Rogan, of course, got his start in mass media, which didn't hurt his success in podcasting and YouTube.
people who are notorious or well-known whining about their fame, and I don't want to do that. But it's still something.
So of course I'm living with women right now. Used to be that my daughters were in college and my boys were home, and so we were living with men. And so we watched Notting Hill the other night. I love Hugh Grant. I enjoy Hugh Grant movies. We were watching Notting Hill, and of course that movie is about Hugh Grant is a small bookshop. I always smile every time Tom Holland talks about Dominion on sale at better bookshops, and I'm like, do you have bookshops in the UK? Here in North America, they've been decimated by Amazon, but where was I going with this? I distract myself. Fame. Of course, Julia Roberts walks into his bookshop and they become lovers and eventually marry. Spoiler alert. It's a rom-com. Where do you think it's going? But yeah, fame is this funny thing where we sort of want it, and then once you have it, do you really want it? It's a tool you can use, but it's also a cost that you bear, along with all this. Go back to what I was talking about, privilege earlier.
Thing interesting to note and to contemplate, and partly to get a handle on. It's been very difficult for me to reconceptualize my circumstances, given that I became well known when I was relatively older. It happened after I was 55, and it's strange. It's strange to understand that the conversation that we're having, is going to be watched and listened to by some hundreds of thousands of people, or perhaps more than that over time. It's uncanny in some sense and surreal.
I just don't understand those numbers, so it doesn't, I can't understand those numbers.
Yeah, well,
So.
and you've grown up with the reality of YouTube, for example. Like, you've grown up in a world where you could be a TV producer as well as a TV consumer. I mean, when I grew up, when I was your age, even a bit younger than that, when I was in my teen years, we had 2 TV channels. It wasn't long before that the United States only had 3. And certainly there was never any conceptualization that any particular individual could become a TV station or a media center. And so it's a very...
So lately I've been talking about platforms too, and the relative platform of the church versus others, and the proliferation of platforms, cable TV, network television to cable TV to on and on and on and on and on. And of course, Andy Warhol's 15 Minutes of Fame.
Very foreign reality for me. And I guess I do have some sense of the numbers, perhaps, because I've done so many live talks and I've seen very large crowds. And in any case, the reason that Michaela and I do this in large part is because, well, we're curious. We wanted to see how it would go, but we're also seeing if we enjoy it. And I'm happy to be here doing something like this with her. It's a real privilege. It goes back to...
it was very interesting on Twitter when Peterson sort of reached out to Elon Musk. People on Twitter are always saying, well, Jordan should talk to you. And it's like, well, maybe he will or maybe he won't. when you're climbing a ladder, you tend to look up. And Michaela was just making that point, that you look up and you try to climb up the rungs. And we have in social media all of these metrics. And so let's say Andrea with the Bangs, or Sam Adam, or Mary Cohen, or The Meaning Code. I have more subs than they do, so I'm up the ladder. But Jonathan Peugeot has more subs than I have, so he's up the ladder. And David Fuller just was on trigonometry, and that was on Twitter, and so I chatted with him on Twitter a little bit. And he, Rebel Wisdom, has 200K subs, so they're up the ladder. And Matthew McConaughey, of course, opens his YouTube channel and very quickly has hundreds of thousands, probably quick soon into the millions of subs. Again, the relationship between mass media and social media. And so you have all of these platforms, and pastors have long had, to a degree, these questions of not fame so much, but a pastor is sort of this minor celebrity in a very small pond, and the dynamics of the pastor's kids. So we're not unaware of those dynamics in the pastoral ministry, a small town mayor, let's say, or something like that. So the dynamics tend to scale, but as Michaela said, these numbers, they sort of begin to boggle your mind. So figuring this stuff out is a very interesting thing. And now, of course, you have the proliferation of potential platforms.
Having children, I don't
even have a joke. I don't even have a joke right now.
I suppose, too, this has been enhanced by my ill health in recent years, but I always feel that it's a privilege to spend time with my children.
As the old preacher saying goes, nobody on their deathbed looks up and says, "I wish I worked more." What do they say? "I wish I'd spent more time with my children. I wish I'd spent more time with my family."
And I have some sense of how fast time goes. I've always had a very acute sense of the finitude of existence. And this is a good hint for people who have children, but with regards to your family members at all, is don't take it for granted. Every second you get that isn't painful, you should cherish.
Yes.
God, I'm maudlin.
Oh, you came up with the joke. That's good.
I felt like I took it as an expression of your love for one another, just with the content that I'd
He has totally taken over this conversation.
watched, and I imagine that would be the motivation, given the trials that you've endured with regard to your health, and then this is of course entirely speculative. That that what preceded it in the rather unique, certainly unparalleled cultural position that you, Jordan, had occupied leading up to the period of abstinence and its accompanying medical complexity. And I know that, but like sort of Tammy, and I know that Michaela, I know that sort of health issues have been quite prevalent, because I'm familiar with you and I'm familiar with your work. And I sensed that it was a sort of a culminative expression of love and gratitude and warmth, and an opportunity for you both to be together. And it's very heartening to hear that it's that. With regard to your sort of inquiry about the nature of sort of public life, for me, the older I get, the more I recognise it was an unsophisticated attempt, as perhaps all early grasps at the Grail must be, of trying to heal the seminal wound of seeking some kind of value, of trying to impose some kind of myth in a mythless world, some pursuit, something of value to chase.
Meaning crisis.
After, and then increasingly discovering as various points in the journey were arrived at, that it couldn't fulfill me. Now, I was sort of comparatively old also, like I wasn't like 16, I was like 30 when I sort of became well known, and when I started to make films in America and things like that. And I always felt that there were I'm sure numerous, but at least two sort of streams running. One, this sort of like a need for validation and approval on a scale that could only indeed be provided by YouTube numbers, Michaela. I'd need to see that speedometer clocking up the 100,000, 200,000. There can never be enough, never a high enough number. This is the that lies at the root, perhaps, of all addiction, this constant requirement for more, and no way of healing that wound, not materially at least.
It's interesting how, as he's talking, I get the sense of the relationship between reciprocal broadening and reciprocal narrowing. And of course, John Vervaeke talks about this in episode 13 of Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, and how on one hand, you've got Russell Brand saying, I had at my heart no end of emptiness that no amount of numbers could fill. Boy, there's a point about human condition. And in that sense, you imagine the reciprocal broadening of ever hungry fame is also then at the same time sort of a reciprocal narrowing where it's all about the numbers. I need more. I need more. It's an addiction, and agency is just continually diminished by this.
But
well, some of that's even actually healthy, Russell. I mean, one of the things that we do constantly is to evaluate our worth by the responses of others. And, if that's all you do, that's a mistake. And if you're doing it in a false way, that's also a mistake, because then you're
And again, what is that? What is the false way and what is the true way? The true way is to say, okay, I'm getting input in terms of, and Peterson's talked about this before, of, how to price things, he talked about. And sometimes free isn't the best price because it doesn't give you the input, of the value so that you can sort of step up and increase the value of what you're doing. But the
gaining as a consequence of doing something that isn't real. But like the person who cares nothing for what anyone else thinks is actually a psychopath, not a saint. And so it's easy.
And so, again, back to Vervaeke stuff, you have opponent processing in this where, okay, you're getting feedback and all of that is good, but you need to have another opponent in there so that it doesn't run amok and your reciprocal broadening becomes reciprocal narrowing and it becomes addiction and you lose agency. And of course, part of what's compelling about the Russell Brand story is that is exactly what happened to him. He lost agency and he had to then suddenly he needed an opponent processing. And it strikes me, often comment about the 12-step program. There needs to be a higher power, higher than what? Higher than everything. Because you're in a sense competing against everything. And that's what needs to put a stop to you.
Easy for that mechanism to go astray in a world that's so dominated by social media, because when before social media, if you were a teenager, it was really important how your peers responded to you, and it should have been, because that's part of apprenticeship. You're socializing yourself against the group at that point, and their opinion should matter. You use them as a proxy for your parents to escape from your parents. It's crucial, even though it can go too far. But now that's elevated to such an immense degree. It's like pornography or cocaine. Both pornography harnesses the sexual drive, and drugs like cocaine hijack the incentive reward, the pleasure circuit. And they're unbelievably powerful. And it's not surprising that you'd be addicted to watching the numbers rack up. I mean, I can see that and experience it as well. It's almost impossible to avoid wanting to see the numbers climb. And to some degree, that's egotistical and it can really lead you astray. But to some degree, it's just the natural workings of a mechanism that is actually there in part to keep you socially acceptable and sane.
Okay, so I've been muting my mic so I can take a sip of my tea and not have to listen to the ice warble around in the tumbler, and then I forget to unmute my mic, and so I'll spare you the content and the attempt at lip reading. But now I have to go back and do commentary again on this section. Oh, the trials of avoiding editing.
Cocaine and pornography. It's difficult to locate comparably potent influences when it comes to more positive attributes.
Now, make sure I'm on here and recording. Yes, I'm making noise. Good, it's being recorded. So part of what's happened with human beings, and my second commentary is always different from the first, is that there's been a scaling up. And perhaps what we're seeing in cocaine and pornography and social media induced fame and, let's say, 16 and 18-year-olds being recruited into the NBA or the NFL, and the fame and the temptations that Russell Brand is saying, or the fame in terms of a comedian and all the temptations in there. Russell Brand is saying, well, what about, are there greater and greater resources available to us? And again, in the 12-step program, you have God. You have the greatest of all possible resources. And built into the gospel is, again, Jesus leading the principalities and powers in triumphal procession. And again, triumphal procession, you're looking at Rome and a Roman triumph where after Julius Caesar conquers Gaul, he leads he leads thousands of slaves in bonds through the streets of Rome, demonstrating his supremacy. That's demonstrating his glory and power over these principalities and powers. And so the point here is that there are resources available, and those are the resources available to us to oppose now the heightened resources as our capacity grows, our temptations grow, and we need another power, again, 12-step language, higher than ourselves to deliver us from these principalities and powers.
Alongside my craving for attention, etc., and perhaps warped ordinary anthropological drives for acceptance, was always a vocational urgency, a devotion, an untapped or at least misguided devotion to that was always present.
Now, this I think also exposes some of the weakness of Jordan's generic meaning and responsibility message, because these things can be employed in good or evil directions. Jordan's sort of truthiness, internal gyroscope of do what is meaning, not what is expedient. It's not a bad little handle, but it is not ultimately a sufficient little handle, because you can find in responsibility and meaningful, things that point you to not great ends.
And I feel that sort of many of the things that I've heard you previously discuss chime with this, if they do not express this exactly. That the problem of not having a shared public myth is that everything is up for grabs for being anointed with that status, without a clear depiction of God as ideals, God as shared standards.
And again, he is picking up on Jordan's sort of minimalist God.
Then why not just pursue fame? Why not just pursue coke if nothing means anything anyway? And it's only sort of more
back to the meaning crisis.
More recently, with in my case, a sort of a spiritual program through the 12 steps, through mentorship, through the obligations that having people that rely on me for their own recovery, as well as being a father. That these, I wouldn't call them secondary, I'm sure they're primary characteristics, but they were secondary in my own behaviour, have been brought to the forefront, have been realised, actuated. And like that, to your point earlier about sort of mentorship, it's not that they just exhibit the divine and that it's, it's only relevant in so much as it may activate the divinity or sublime energy in the mentee. I see it as beyond that. I see it somehow as a kind of symbiosis, a kind of osmosis, a kind of that it isn't ultimately the optimistic view of life, one of oneness, one of.
Okay, symbiosis, osmosis. Again, a symbiotic relationship is they're two, but they're joined. Osmosis is a semi-permeable membrane where there's transference to the other. And that I do think to a degree of Vervaeke's observations, because Vervaeke is always sort of back and forth. That's a lot of the motion of Vervaeke's system. Now, oneness, and now we're sort of knocking on the door of Neoplatonism. And so part of what's brand is very broad and very open, but there's a certain slipperiness and lack of definition in this too, where there's just throw it all there in the sink.
Of love that's separate, that we are not ultimately separate.
Well, and then figuring out, okay, in what ways are we and in what ways aren't we? So you want to pursue that definition.
Therefore, there is recourse to the universal. There is a possibility of me, in admiring another person or adoring another person, imbibing and taking on these attributes. If the ultimate reality is separation, separateness, and I sometimes...
I think that takes us back to the discussion about the so-called Christian transformation of the idea of God. I've had Jewish friends of mine point out that the God of the Old Testament gets a bad rap from Christians to some degree, and that there's a lot more love there than you might presume if you viewed the New Testament as a transformation of the Old Testament God into the God of love. But we'll leave that aside. I think it's a valid point, but we'll leave that aside. The question, if you're mentored in a particular direction, well, here's how you might conceive of it. Is there something that all mentors share in common? Well, you would say so because they're all in the category mentors. And then you might say that, well, whatever all mentors share in common is the pattern of the divine. Again, that's almost by definition. Now, then there's a deeper question, which is, okay, if what all mentors share in common is the pattern of the divine, is that a real pattern? And the answer...
Pattern of the divine, it's an awfully big pattern. What aspect? Divinity itself, divinity as top of the hierarchy.
That to some degree as well, you'll find that out by acting it out. And it seems to me that the answer to that has to be yes. I mean, if we're adapted to the world, and if we pursue the fullest extent of the possibilities of our adaptation through mentorship, then, and if that improves the quality of our life, then it seems that whatever it is that mentorship is pushing towards is real insofar as it works in the world. Now,
Yes.
Does that mean it's materially real or objectively real? I don't think that reality is bound completely by the categories of objective and subjective. I don't think that captures the entire essence of reality.
What he says right there is actually pretty key and foundational with the Peugeot conversation, and with a lot of part of why he plays a materialist in the lab, you might say.
So, but I don't believe that our instinct towards mentorship is a delusion. I don't believe that our religious instinct is a delusion either, even though all instincts can go astray.
Yes, and when you were saying that this idea of Christianity being that, if we...
Interesting how he's got the crucifix tattooed to his bicep. I didn't know that. Interesting.
We live in God's light, or we aspire to God's light, or if we embody God's love, then that this is beneficial. I was thinking how, as a paradigm, it's comparable to the Taoist idea that you are bringing the path into being as you walk it, that you are like...
Oh, and he's got Ganesh on the other bicep. And always the white t-shirt with what's a brand. What is that?
That reality is interacting with your consciousness, that your belief, your perception, the manner in which you behold and enact your life, influences life, becomes life, is life. And in that tradition, and let me tell you, I know barely anything about it, it's sort of presented in a more Gnostic way. It's sort of somewhat more opaque, it's more minimal, as one would expect, housed as it is within that culture. But the central message appears to be the same, that there is no objective, that these categories of objective and subjective perhaps have to be simultaneously held, perhaps opposed, perhaps are interchangeable, that reality is being believed into being through our consciousness, through the agency of our consciousness. Certainly we can never know what reality was.
Someone asked on Twitter, how would Jonathan Peugeot and Russell Brand talk? Well, that would be a conversation I would be interested in listening to. And here, right now, he's talking about attention, which is what was a big piece of Peugeot and Peterson's conversation.
Separate from our consciousness is.
Well, I don't think we would ever sacrifice if we didn't believe that reality was opaque to our beliefs, because we sacrifice because we believe in the possibility of a better future being brought into reality by our actions. And that actually seems to work. I mean, it's quite remarkable. We can imagine something, we can strategize toward it, and it generally it manifests itself well enough so that we don't stop doing that. And it's quite remarkable that that's the case.
On that note, I hate to break this up because...
Whose podcast was this? It was Russell Brand's podcast. I'm going to pause here because I don't remember if they say anything decent before the third part of the podcast, which is actually, again, quite lovely because it's just Jordan and his daughter. All right, there's a little bit more.
I have a book coming out on Audible, which I'd love to talk to you about, further about the finding the sacred in the everyday. With the rather grand title, Revelation. You'll be pleased to hear, like where I'm just talking about that I personally can't live.
And again, back to, those of you who just watch, obviously the video commentaries of Jordan Peterson stuff get more views than the Paul Vanderklay monologue conversations or the conversations with randos that I do, but. Platform here. Does Russell Brand start a church? That Douthit made that conversation. I have it in a clip on my abandoned clip channel. Maybe I should make an even tinier clip so that I can just quickly insert it into all of these, because that observation that in the 19th century Russell Brand would have started a church. He doesn't. He has a YouTube channel. He has publishing. And he has followers. And this also, to a certain degree, gets into the Peugeot-Peterson conversation where, Jordan has fans. And Peugeot, I think exactly right, says, it's not a church. Because the problem with fans is that you're at the top of this fame hierarchy with your fans. That's actually not what you need. And okay, so maybe you get a degree of accountability that if you cross your fans, but we call that, being captured by your audience. And that's not a good thing. Again and again in the Gospels, the crowd, the audience, Jesus will not be captured by his audience. And Jesus will not wield the crowd for political ends, which is what many would desire. And so part of how a church is different than if you are the head, if the church is yours and you're the head of your own church, you have a real problem. Someone on Twitter said, well, if Jordan starts a church, then Paul and Jonathan Peugeot will be priests. And it's like, you really don't understand where Jonathan and I are coming from in this thing, because we already have a master and it's not Jordan. So
how I find it in a post-secular world. Like when you were just talking just then, sorry to interrupt, my own hard day, without, like where I'm just talking about that I personally can't live without sacredness present in my ordinary life. And
what's interesting about that is, okay, what is sacred? That is the intrusion and the privilege of the owner, of the author, of the ultimate, and how that ripples down and organizes us into a hierarchy, because sacred is pretty much at the top and common is down below and profane is against. But, to have the Church of Russell Brand, he would be sacred. But he's basically saying how in life he needs the sacred. He needs something above himself in order for he himself, his own little hierarchy that is him, to be properly arranged. And it's for that reason that your fans can't be a church, because you need something above yourself. You need something outside the system. And we see that in Viktor Frankl's observation about you need something outside the camp in order to survive the camp. You see that in Jordan Peterson's political observation in the first biblical lecture, where in Christianity, the king is accountable to the God. And so that's why if you are the sacred thing in your own religious platform, you will undoubtedly go astray.
How I find it in a post-secular world. Like when you were just talking just then, sorry to interrupt my own hard out, but I was thinking that perhaps much of the dissatisfaction, polemicism and fragmentation that we're currently experiencing is a result of people not feeling that agency, not feeling like this like the ability that you say to manifest your reality through the practice of certain principles. It feels like that we're having a sort of an externally imposed nihilism, that you can't influence reality, that you can't impact reality. These swathes of disillusioned, disenfranchised, dismissed people. It just.
But the same thing comes if there isn't something sacred that is above you, and so what tends to happen is that. Is that we locate the sacred in and of ourselves, and that is insufficient by virtue of what he just laid out. There must be something above you. You cannot be your own Savior and Lord. You cannot be your own God. You are not capable of that. Had to let the coffee break ladies out.
It occurred to me when you were talking just then.
I think you can influence reality. That's what I've decided. It's too weird. It doesn't make any sense otherwise. It's the simplest explanation.
It's called agency. We all know that.
So when is that book coming out, Russell?
I think it's in March, which might be so far into the future as not to exist in the sort of social space that we're currently occupying.
So that's why I think this is probably January, early February that they're doing that. So
in March. How long have you worked on it?
I worked in it for a couple of years, sort of like leading up to and during the pandemic. Do we still have March? Is March still a thing? Do we have equinoxes now, or equini? What is reality now?
Well, hopefully we'll return to something more approximating normal reality when this pandemic ceases to exist. God willing.
God willing.
So happy. I'm so happy to see you looking so well, and to see you both together as a family, as a father and a daughter. And it's very comforting for me as a father of two daughters to see you working together well, and to see so many of the principles that you have espoused and beautifully articulated, Jordan, manifest in you, Michaela. It's a real privilege to meet you both. Thank you.
Thank you, Russell Brand.
Very good to see you again, Russell.
I hope I get to see you. I've got your email. I'll be in touch. I've got both your emails. Stay in touch.
You have a remarkable capacity to dig into things.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's a beautiful compliment from you.
Yeah, well, it's quite striking. I remember the last couple of times we spoke, I was struck exactly the same way, is that you have a very fast mind, and it goes down a long ways.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's a wonderful compliment. If it were earlier in the day and I'd made the giddy life choices to have children in my 20s, I would stay up now with pornography on another screen and cocaine on the back of my hand, chatting into the long hours. But perhaps if those were the choices I made, I wouldn't find myself in this esteemed company.
Well, have a good
On
night.
that note.
Yeah, have a good night.
Good
God
night.
bless you both.
Good night.
Beautiful conversation. So, yeah. So there's another half hour of Jordan and Michaela, and we'll see if I do commentary on that. This is like a holy week for me, and I always try to take a day with my wife this week if I can, because for some reason the Sacramento Unified School District always takes this week for their spring break, and it's like doesn't help me and my wife because I've got a busy week and she's got off. So maybe we'll take a little day trip tomorrow. I've got the conversation I did with Rafe Kelly, which is coming up, and that's already on his channel. That was a terrific conversation. I have another conversation with a small podcaster he's got a small podcast. He's a student at Trinity Seminary, and that was a great conversation. So those will come through the channel at some point, but I wanted to get these commentary videos out fairly quickly because that's usually the best way to do it. So thanks for watching. Leave a comment.